I didn't realize my future had already been decided until I heard my own name spoken in that careful, distant tone people use when they're discussing logistics instead of lives. And it happened on an ordinary afternoon when I was sitting at the dining table, sorting through old bills with my reading glasses slipping down my nose. The house quiet except for the ticking of the clock. When my son Imran and my daughter Farah walked in together and exchanged a look that told me this conversation had been rehearsed without me, Imran cleared his throat first, always the one who liked to take charge, and said, "Abba, we need to talk about what's best for you." And even before he continued, I felt something tighten in my chest because what's best for you rarely includes your own voice once people reach a certain age. Farah sat down across from me, folding her hands neatly, her expression soft but resolved, and I noticed how neither of them asked if I was tired or how my day had been or whether I even wanted to talk, as if the decision to speak had already overridden the need for consent. "We've been discussing your situation," Imran continued, avoiding my eyes, "and we think it's time to make some changes. You're not as independent as you used to be." "Not as independent," he said, like it was a medical diagnosis instead of an assumption, and I almost laughed because that very morning I had walked to the market alone, carried my own groceries, cooked my own meal, and paid my own bills, but none of that seemed to count because independence in their eyes had less to do with ability and more to do with appearance. "You live too quietly," Farah added gently, the way she always softened Imran's bluntness. "You don't go out much, you don't spend money. You don't have plans, it worries us." I looked at her, my daughter who used to fall asleep on my chest when she was a child, and I wondered when quiet became something to fear rather than respect. So I asked calmly, "What changes have you planned?" Imran hesitated for a fraction of a second, then said, "We think you should move somewhere safer, somewhere with people your age, a place where you don't have to worry about managing things." Manage what? I wanted to ask my own existence. But I stayed silent because I wanted to hear the full shape of the future they had built for me without bothering to ask what I wanted. "There's a very good assisted living facility near Farah's place," Imran went on. "Doctors on call, meals provided, activities. It would be easier for everyone." Easier for everyone, there it was, the real reason hiding behind concern. Farah nodded quickly. "We'll handle the paperwork," she said. "You won't have to stress about anything." I studied their faces, earnest and convinced, and I realized they weren't being cruel, they were being efficient, and that somehow hurt more because efficiency leaves no room for dignity. "In my house?" I asked quietly. Imran waved a hand dismissively. "We'll take care of it, sell it probably. There's no point keeping it empty, and the money can be used for your care." Used for my care, as if my life had already been reduced to an expense line. I nodded slowly, absorbing each word, each assumption, feeling a strange mix of disappointment and clarity settle over me because this wasn't about safety or comfort, it was about control, about my children's discomfort with the idea that their father still owned his life. "When did you decide all this?" I asked. Farah bit her lip. "We've been talking about it for a while," she admitted. "Ever since Mom passed." That name, my wife's name, unspoken but present, hung in the air like a ghost, and I felt a familiar ache because her absence had created a vacuum my children were now rushing to fill with decisions instead of understanding. "And you didn't think to ask me?" I said, not angry, just tired. Imran frowned slightly. "Abba, we know you. You just say you're fine and avoid the conversation." I almost smiled at the irony. My silence, once a sign of trust, had now become an excuse to erase my consent. "So you decided for me?" I said. Farah reached across the table and touched my hand. "We're just trying to protect you," she whispered. "Protect me from what?" I wondered, my own choices. I looked down at our joined hands, her fingers warm and familiar, and I felt something solid form inside me, not defiance, but resolve. "I hear you," I said slowly, "but you've planned my future without my permission." Imran sighed, clearly frustrated. "Abu, please don't make this difficult. We're doing what's practical." Practical, the word people use when they don't want to acknowledge the emotional cost of their actions. I withdrew my hand gently and stood up, my knees stiff but steady, and said, "If you're planning my future, then we should at least do it properly." Imran looked relieved. "Exactly," he said. "That's all we're saying." "No," I replied, meeting his eyes now. "I mean properly with records." Farah blinked. "What records?" "The ones you haven't looked at," I said, and for the first time that afternoon they both looked uncertain. That night, alone in my room, I sat on the bed and stared at the old wooden cupboard where I kept documents most people assumed didn't exist because they'd never asked. The records my wife and I had organized meticulously over decades, not because we were wealthy in a flashy way, but because we believed order was a form of respect for the future. I opened the cupboard and pulled out the familiar folders, the smell of old paper grounding me, and I thought about how often I had chosen simplicity over explanation. How often I had let my children believe I had little because it spared them envy, expectation, or entitlement, and how that same choice had now been used to justify making decisions on my behalf. I didn't feel angry as I reviewed the documents, property deeds, investment summaries, letters from institutions, but I did feel a quiet sadness because it had come to this, because my children would need proof to listen to the man who raised them. The next morning, Imran brought up the facility again over breakfast, already discussing timelines, and I listened without interruption until he finished, then said, "Before anything happens, we're having a meeting." He looked surprised. "A meeting?" "Yes," I said, "with a lawyer." Farah's eyes widened. "Why?" "Because if you're planning my future," I replied evenly, "you should understand my past." Imran hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine," he said, "if it makes you feel better." "Makes me feel better." He still didn't understand, but he would. I made the call that afternoon, my voice steady as I spoke to the lawyer my wife had trusted, the one who already knew more about my life than my children ever had. And when he suggested a formal review of records, I agreed without hesitation because this wasn't about confrontation, it was about clarity. When I told Imran and Farah the date and time, they accepted with casual confidence, convinced it would be a short meeting that confirmed their assumptions. And as I watched them go back to their routines, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me, because for the first time since my wife passed, I wasn't reacting to decisions made around me. I was shaping the moment where those decisions would finally be questioned. They thought they were planning my future, and maybe they were, but they had forgotten one important thing. A future built without listening is fragile, and the records they had ignored for years were about to speak, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly enough that even those who had already decided would have no choice but to finally hear me. The days between that conversation and the scheduled meeting passed with a politeness so careful it felt brittle, like a thin sheet of glass stretched over unspoken tension, and I moved through the house aware that my children were watching me differently now, not with concern exactly, but with curiosity, as if they were trying to anticipate a version of me they had already decided would confirm their assumptions. Imran continued to talk about timelines and facilities as though the decision were merely paused, not questioned. And Farah tried to soften his certainty by asking if I wanted tea or needed anything from the market, small gestures that carried kindness but still avoided the larger truth that they had already pictured my life shrinking into a room chosen by someone else. I didn't argue because argument would have turned this into a battle of emotions, and emotions are easily dismissed when people believe age has made you unreasonable. So instead I prepared quietly, returning each afternoon to the cupboard where the records lived, opening folders I hadn't touched in years, running my fingers over documents that told a story my children had never bothered to ask about. There were deeds signed in years when money was tight and risk was high. Investments made not with optimism but with discipline, letters from banks acknowledging accounts that had grown slowly and steadily because I had never needed them to impress anyone. And as I sorted and organized, I felt a strange steadiness take hold of me, the kind that comes when you stop defending yourself and start presenting facts. Farah noticed the change before Imran did. One evening she lingered by my door watching me align papers on the bed and asked softly, "Papa, why didn't you ever tell us about all this?" I didn't look up. "Because you never asked," I replied, and though the words were gentle, they landed with weight because silence isn't always secrecy, sometimes it's simply trust misplaced. She sat down then, her voice unsteady. "We thought you were struggling," she admitted. "You live so simply. You never talk about plans." I met her eyes. "I stopped talking about plans when I realized people confuse simplicity with helplessness," I said, and she nodded slowly, understanding dawning too late to change what had already been set in motion. Imran, meanwhile, grew restless as the meeting approached, his confidence giving way to irritation because uncertainty is uncomfortable for people who rely on control. And one night at dinner he said sharply, "Abu, you're making this bigger than it needs to be," as if my insistence on being heard were an inconvenience. "If there's paperwork, fine, but it doesn't change the reality that you're getting older." I looked at him calmly. "Aging doesn't erase ownership," I said, "it clarifies it." He scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The morning of the meeting arrived without drama, and that somehow made it heavier. Imran drove, Farah sat beside him, and I took the back seat, watching familiar streets pass by, thinking about how many times I had driven these roads when they were young, worrying about their future, never imagining they would one day try to take mine over in the name of efficiency. The lawyer's office was quiet and orderly, a space that valued precision over opinion, and as we sat down, I noticed how Imran immediately leaned forward, ready to speak, while Farah clasped her hands tightly, bracing herself for something she could sense but not yet see. The lawyer greeted us politely and asked for confirmation of purpose, and before Imran could answer, I said, "We're here to review records," emphasizing the word just enough to signal that this meeting would not be about speculation. Imran raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The lawyer opened the first folder and began methodically, explaining that before any decisions about relocation or asset management could be discussed, it was necessary to understand the full scope of my holdings, and I saw Imran relax slightly, clearly expecting a short explanation that would justify his plan. That expectation lasted less than 5 minutes. "This property," the lawyer said, sliding a document forward, "is registered solely under Mr. Khan's name," and Imran frowned. "Which property?" he asked. The lawyer named an address Imran recognized immediately, his posture stiffening as realization set in. That's the old building near the market," he said slowly. "I thought it belonged to someone else." "It belongs to your father," the lawyer replied evenly, and Farah's breath caught audibly. The lawyer continued without pause, moving from one record to the next, and with each document the story my children believed about my life lost another piece of ground. There were accounts they didn't know existed, investments that contradicted the idea that I was unprepared, and carefully worded letters that demonstrated a level of foresight they had never attributed to me. Imran's questions grew fewer and more cautious, his earlier confidence replaced by a tight concentration that bordered on disbelief. "Why wouldn't you tell us?" he finally asked, unable to hold back. I answered calmly, Because my life wasn't a report I owed you, I said, and the lawyer, sensing the shift, paused long enough to let the words settle. When the lawyer explained that many of these records included explicit instructions regarding autonomy, that no relocation or sale could occur without my consent, Farah covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling as the weight of what they had planned without me finally hit her. So we can't just decide, she whispered. No, the lawyer said kindly. You can't. Imran leaned back, stunned, the reality of his assumption laid bare in front of him. We thought you had nothing left, he admitted quietly, and this time there was no defensiveness in his voice, only realization. I looked at him then, really looked at my son, and said, I had something left because I chose not to spend it proving myself. The meeting continued with clarifications and confirmations, but the tone had changed completely. My children now listened instead of directing, their questions tentative, their posture altered, and when the lawyer concluded by saying any future planning must be led by Mr. Khan himself, I felt no triumph, only relief, because being heard is not about winning, it's about existing without permission. As we left the office, the silence between us was heavy but different from before, no longer dismissive but reflective. And I knew that while the records had forced them to listen, the real work was just beginning, because understanding a parent's past is one thing, accepting their right to a future of their own choosing is another, and that acceptance would not come easily, but it had finally, unmistakably begun. The silence that followed us out of the lawyer's office felt heavier than the conversation inside it, not because words were missing, but because too many had finally landed where they couldn't be ignored. And as we walked to the car, I noticed how Imran no longer walked ahead of me with the certainty of a man leading a decision, but slowed his pace, unconsciously matching mine, while Farah stayed close at my side. Her arm brushing against mine like she needed the reassurance of contact after realizing how close she had come to pushing me away. The drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums with thought rather than discomfort, and I watched their reflections in the windshield, seeing them process something unfamiliar. The idea that their father was not a problem to solve but a person they had failed to fully know. When we reached the house, Imran didn't turn off the engine immediately. He sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead before finally exhaling and saying, I thought I was doing the right thing, and though his voice held regret, it also held confusion, as if he were still trying to reconcile his intentions with the outcome. You were trying to be efficient, I replied gently. But lives don't work on schedules. Farah nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, I didn't mean to make you feel invisible, and that word, invisible, settled into me because it described the ache I hadn't known how to name. Over the next few days, the house shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Conversations that once happened over my head now paused until I was included. Decisions were framed as questions instead of conclusions, and though the change felt awkward at first, like learning a new posture after years of slouching, it also felt necessary, like muscles remembering their proper alignment. Imran struggled the most, not because he didn't care, but because control had been his language of love, and without it, he didn't know how to show concern without overstepping. One evening he hovered in the doorway of my room, hands shoved into his pockets, and asked, Do you want help organizing things? And I smiled softly, recognizing the effort behind the clumsy offer. I've been organizing my whole life, I said, but if you want to learn, you can sit. He did, awkwardly at first, then more comfortably, listening as I explained why I kept records the way I did, why simplicity didn't mean neglect, and I saw something shift in him, not admiration but understanding, which is far rarer and far more useful. Farah, meanwhile, began asking questions about the past she'd never thought to explore, about how her mother and I made decisions when money was uncertain, how we balanced restraint with responsibility, and one afternoon, as we sat together looking through old photographs, she stopped at a picture of me standing beside a modest building and said quietly, I never realized how much you carried without telling us, and I answered honestly, I thought carrying it quietly was part of the job. The estate records, once revealed, had done their work, but what lingered was the discomfort of recognition, the realization that they had mistaken calm for absence and preparation for passivity. Imran admitted one night, his voice low and unguarded, that watching me live so simply frightened him, that it made him think I was slowly disappearing, and that planning my future had been his way of coping with that fear. And while I understood that fear, I also made it clear that fear does not give permission to erase someone's agency. I didn't need you to rescue me, I told him. I needed you to ask me. That sentence stayed with him. I could see it in the way he paused before speaking now, in the way he checked himself when old habits threatened to resurface. A week later, another meeting with the lawyer was scheduled, not to confront but to clarify, and this time the tone was entirely different. Imran sat back and listened. Farah took notes quietly, and when the lawyer asked who would be leading decisions moving forward, Imran looked at me instead of answering, a small but powerful acknowledgement that control had been returned where it belonged. Walking out of that meeting, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Ease, not because everything was resolved, but because the direction had changed, and direction matters more than speed. At home, my children began adjusting their expectations in ways that went beyond words. They stopped framing my independence as risk, stopped interpreting my routines as decline, and I realized how deeply narratives shape behavior. Once they saw me as capable, they treated me that way, and capability, when respected, tends to reinforce itself. One afternoon, while watching my grandchildren play, Imran sat beside me and said, almost to himself, I didn't think about how insulting it must have felt. And I replied, most disrespect isn't intentional, it's just unexamined. He nodded, absorbing that truth, and in that moment I felt the distance between us narrow, not because he had apologized, but because he had reflected. The records had forced them to listen, yes, but listening had forced them to confront something deeper, the realization that planning someone's future without them is a quiet form of erasure, even when wrapped in concern. As days passed, I noticed how often Imran now asked, what do you think? And how Farah waited for my answer without rushing to fill silence, and I understood that what had changed wasn't just their behavior, but their perception of time itself. They no longer saw my life as something winding down, but as something still unfolding on its own terms. Late one night, sitting alone with a cup of tea, I reflected on how close I had come to being neatly relocated, my autonomy boxed up with my belongings, and how easily that could have happened if I had continued choosing silence over clarity. And I felt a quiet gratitude for the records, for the preparation, but most of all for the moment I decided that being peaceful did not require being passive. The hardest part wasn't forcing my children to listen. It was allowing myself to insist on being heard. And now, as the house settled into a new rhythm shaped by respect rather than assumption, I knew the next phase of this journey would not be about proving anything further, but about rebuilding trust on terms that included me fully, because the future they had planned without me was no longer possible, and the one we would move towards slowly, imperfectly, would finally be shaped by conversation instead of control. By the time the next phase of decisions arrived, I could feel that something fundamental had shifted in the way my children approach me. But change, I've learned, doesn't announce itself with certainty. It tests itself quietly, waiting to see whether it will be resisted or allowed to settle, and this was no exception. Imran, who once spoke in conclusions, now spoke in pauses, stopping himself mid-sentence more than once as if checking whether his words were about to cross an old line. And Farah, who used to smooth everything over with gentle agreement, had begun to listen more than she spoke, her silence no longer dismissive but attentive. The real test came when practical matters resurfaced, not from urgency but from habit, and one afternoon Imran brought up the assisted living facility again, this time cautiously, his tone measured rather than decisive. I know we talked about this before, he said, and I know we were wrong to decide without you, but I still worry sometimes, not because I think you can't manage, just because I don't want you to feel alone. I appreciated the honesty, even if the question itself carried old echoes. Loneliness isn't cured by relocation, I replied calmly. It's cured by presence. Farah nodded, her eyes thoughtful, and for the first time the conversation didn't escalate into defensiveness or retreat. It simply rested there, acknowledged and unresolved, which was progress in itself. In the days that followed, my children began adjusting their involvement in ways that felt respectful rather than intrusive. Imran stopped scheduling things for me and instead asked whether I wanted his help. And Farah stopped hovering while still checking in, finding a balance that neither smothered nor abandoned. And I realized how rare that balance is, how many families never find it because they mistake authority for care. Another meeting with the lawyer was scheduled, not because there was conflict, but because clarity had created questions, and this time the tone was almost collaborative. Imran arrived with notes, Farah brought questions, and when the lawyer asked who would be making final decisions, they both turned toward me without hesitation, a small but profound acknowledgement that my voice was no longer conditional. As the discussion moved through contingencies, health directives, property management, future planning, I noticed how my children reacted differently to information they once would have seized as justification for control. Instead of interpreting details as risks to manage, they treated them as realities to respect, and that shift told me everything I needed to know. After the meeting, we sat together in a nearby cafe, something we hadn't done in years without an agenda, and the conversation drifted naturally, touching on memories, shared frustrations, and even laughter, tentative at first, then genuine, and I felt a quiet warmth settle in my chest, not because all wounds had healed, but because they were finally being acknowledged. Imran surprised me then by asking about my own plans, what I wanted to do in the coming years, how I imagined my days, and the question itself felt like a gift because no one had asked me that in a long time. I want continuity, I said after a moment's thought. I don't need excitement, I need purpose. Farah smiled softly. You've always had that, she said, we just stopped seeing it. Over the following weeks, that recognition deepened. My routines were no longer viewed as signs of decline but as deliberate choices, my quiet days respected rather than pitied, and when I chose to spend time alone, it was seen as preference, not neglect. The grandchildren, sensing the shift long before the adults fully understood it, gravitated toward me again with an ease that told me children recognize presence instinctively. And sitting with them, answering their endless questions, I felt a sense of continuity that no document could ever provide. One evening, as Imran and I stood together in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, he said quietly, I didn't realize how much I was projecting my fear onto you, and I placed a hand on his shoulder, firm but gentle. Fear is loud, I said, trust is quiet. He nodded, absorbing the truth without argument, and I could see the weight lifting from him, replaced by something steadier. The records had done their job. They had forced my children to listen, yes, but more importantly, they had forced them to pause, and in that pause, reflection had found room to grow. I understood then that what we were rebuilding was not authority, but relationship, one rooted not in hierarchy or obligation, but in mutual recognition, and that kind of rebuilding takes time, patience, and a willingness to sit with discomfort rather than rushing to erase it. As weeks turned into months, the future my children once planned without me faded quietly, replaced by one shaped through conversation, compromise, and respect. And I felt a deep sense of peace knowing that even if disagreements returned, as they always do in families, they would now be approached with listening instead of assumption. Standing one morning at the window, watching the familiar rhythm of the street below, I reflected on how easily a life can be misread when it is lived quietly, and how important it is sometimes to let the truth speak plainly, not to prove worth, but to preserve dignity, because the future that matters most is not the one others designed for you, but the one that remains yours to choose fully and unmistakably. The true ending did not arrive with a document being signed or a final meeting with the lawyer, but in the slow, quiet way life settles once the tension drains out of it. And I noticed it first one early morning when I woke before dawn and realized I no longer felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that had formed when I thought my own children saw me as a problem waiting to be solved. I sat at the small table by the window with a cup of tea, watching the street come alive, and for the first time in months, I felt like the day ahead belonged to me again, not as borrowed time or supervised freedom, but as something I was still trusted to shape. Imran joined me a little later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and instead of launching into plans or reminders, he simply asked, "What are you thinking of doing today?" The question itself carried more respect than any apology could because it assumed I had intentions worth asking about. "I'll go to the market," I said, "then maybe visit an old friend." He nodded easily. "Do you want company?" he asked, not insisting, not hovering, and when I said no, he smiled and said, "All right, let me know if you change your mind." That small exchange told me everything had changed. Farah, too, had found her own way back to balance. She no longer tried to manage my days through concern disguised as care, but she listened more closely when I spoke, remembering details, asking follow-up questions, and one evening she admitted, her voice quiet and steady, "I think I was afraid that if I didn't plan your future, there wouldn't be one." I looked at her then, really looked, and saw not a daughter trying to control, but a daughter trying not to lose. "The future doesn't disappear just because it isn't loud," I told her, and she nodded, wiping at her eyes, finally understanding that my quiet had always been a form of continuity, not decline. The assisted living brochures disappeared from the dining table without ceremony, folded away and never mentioned again, and the house itself seemed to relax, conversations flowing more naturally now that no one was silently bracing for disagreement. I noticed how my grandchildren treated me differently too, sensing the shift long before the adults named it, climbing into my lap without hesitation, asking me questions with curiosity instead of caution, and I realized how deeply children respond to restored authority that is calm rather than imposed. One afternoon, while helping one of them with homework, Imran stood in the doorway watching, and he said quietly, "I forgot how much steadiness you bring to a room." And I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with recognition. The records that had forced them to listen were filed away, no longer weapons or shields, just evidence of a life lived with foresight, but their impact lingered in the way my children now paused before speaking, in the way they consulted rather than concluded, and in the way my presence was no longer treated as temporary. A final conversation came unexpectedly one evening when Imran sat beside me on the balcony, the city lights flickering below us, and said, "I think I was planning your future because I didn't know how to sit with uncertainty." I nodded, understanding more than he realized. "Uncertainty doesn't need solutions," I said. "It needs patience." He was quiet for a long time after that, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was lighter. "I'm glad you made us listen," he said. "Even if it was uncomfortable," I smiled faintly. "Listening usually is," I replied. As weeks turned into months, the shape of my life settled into something steady and deeply satisfying, not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. I continued living simply, not as a statement, but as a preference, and now my children understood the difference, no longer mistaking restraint for fragility. I returned to my routines with renewed ease, taking walks, reading, spending time in thought without feeling watched, and I realized how much energy I had spent before justifying my existence, energy that was now free to be used simply on living. One night, alone in my room, I opened the cupboard where the records were kept and looked at the neatly stacked folders, then closed it again, not because I was done with the past, but because I no longer needed it to speak for me. The truth had already done its work. Lying in bed, listening to the quiet sounds of a home that once again felt like mine, I thought about how close I had come to being carefully displaced, how easily love mixed with fear can turn into control, and how important it is sometimes to draw a line gently but firmly before dignity erodes beyond recognition. My children had planned my future without me, believing they were acting out of care, but the records had forced them to listen, and listening had forced them to see, and seeing had changed everything. In the end, what mattered was not that they learned what I owned or how prepared I was, but that they remembered who I was, a man still capable of choosing, still deserving of agency, still present in his own life. As sleep finally took me that night, I felt a deep, settled peace, knowing that my future was no longer something being arranged in another room, but something unfolding quietly, deliberately, and unmistakably under my own hand, exactly the way it always should have been.